was influenced early on in my career by two other people. Herd Willett, who was an MIT professor who believed in solar cycles and attended one of my first organized conferences, and we sat and talked for a long time, and he believed in many different cycles in the sun and believed the temperatures would be seen to correlate very well with that, with the proper analysis. And we have ourselves looked at the solar factor, and other scientists have too, and found a very strong correlation with the sun on a long-term basis and over the centuries and millennia, but also over the last 100 years. There is a variance of 60-year cycle that matches the temperature cycle very well. The other person who influenced me was Jerome Namias, who was the first director of long-range forecasting at the National Weather Service back in the 1950s. He then moved on to Scripps Oceanographic in California, where he was the director. And he told me about the importance of the oceans. We already knew a little bit about El Nino, but he said, even the mid and high latitude ocean is characterized by large warm and cold pools that tend to persist for a long period of time. And they kind of anchor the jet stream so that you wind up with a predominance of, say, cold temperatures, as you've seen in the western United States this spring and early summer, and warm temperatures in the next downstream ridge over the eastern U.S. as the 100-degree temperatures that occurred in parts of the East in recent weeks. And last year, a very different configuration of the jet stream when the temperatures were different. So the oceans, we believe, are driven by the sun. The sun drives the oceans to go into these modes, and the sun and the ocean work together to control the weather that we...
The weather or the climate?
Both.
Okay.
The climate, for sure, weather can vary. Last winter was one of the colder winters for the U.S. as a whole. We averaged 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit below normal for the U.S., for the lower 48 states. That's a rather significant cold winter. But there was some breaks in that. That's weather.
What's the difference between climate and weather? Because we talk about them often synonymously.
Climate is what you expect, and weather is what you get, I guess is the easiest way to put it. Climate is an average or mean and range of conditions for a given location for a particular time of year, whereas weather is what actually does take place and can vary, as you know, very much on even day to day. Weather can be very different from the normal, and that's basically what they're looking at. They're looking at departures from the normal.
But isn't climate something that's measured over long periods of time versus
Yes,
weather
exactly.
is what happens that day?
They all use different base periods. The satellite groups that measure temperatures globally with satellites had data available starting in 1979. They used 1979 to 1998 averages as their normals. NOAA uses the whole data period from 1895 to the current as their normal, the average during that time, and they compute an average temperature for a location or for the world and compare it to that long-term average. And that's what they focus on for climate change, is what they call anomalies or departures from average.
I have a question about the solar cycles, and then I want to go back and talk to you about cement and greenhouse gases again. What I've heard is that the solar cycles directly connect and relate to tremendous cooling or tremendous heating. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you know what solar cycle we're in now?
We're in cycle number 24. First one they started counting was in the 1700s. Cycle 23 lasted 12.7 years, which is 3 years longer than the prior two cycles, 2 to 3 years longer. Very unusually long and quiet cycle. We had over 802, I believe, sun-spotless days, days where even with the best satellites on many places around the world, we couldn't spot a dark sunspot on the surface of the sun for a calendar day. And
what does that mean to us?
Well, sun-spotless days and long cycles are characteristic of a cooling climate. We saw such a behavior in the early 1900s. We saw a mini version of that in the 1960s and 70s, which maybe accounted for the cooling that we saw then, but a much more significant solar quiet period in the early 1900s, but especially the early 1800s and late 1700s, a period that was called the Dalton minimum.
Is that a solar minimum?
Solar minimum, right. Even the peaks of the solar cycles were very low with not many sunspots. and so there was less output from the sun. It was a period of cold weather. It was the age of Dickens when children played in the snow in London on a regular basis in winter, and even the Thames River froze over from time to time. Well, in the last few years, you've probably seen in the news pictures of snow in London and England, and people saying, we're not used to this. What's going on? It could be the sun is a factor there.
Do you think we're headed into an ice age like Robert Felix does? Or do you feel that we're headed into challenging times that are getting colder and colder? What's your perspective?
I believe that we're heading to at least the Dalton minimum kind of cooling, which could be a degree or two Celsius globally over the next couple of decades.
What does that mean, a degree or two Celsius?
Oh, about 3 degrees Fahrenheit globally. It means summers are, you're still going to get your heat waves, but on average, summers will be cooler, winters will be colder and longer, more extreme. There'll be plenty of snow, and snow in places like last winter where you don't often get snow. The issue is that cold is much worse than warm. They want to stop carbon dioxide and stop this dangerous warming that's measured in tenths of a degree. The average person could not tell the difference between 56 and 57 degrees, and yet they want to tell us that's catastrophic in that kind of a global average mean temperature change. But 3 degrees cooling is significant, and what it would do, probably the worst impact would be on agriculture.
I was going to say crops.
Crops, because you get longer winters, and that means that you get late frosts, and they have to replant, and then you get early frost, and maybe it catches the plant before it's mature, and the Dalton minimum, and even more so the Maunder minimum, which was an even deeper solar minimum in the 1700s, is characterized by a lot of crop failures and famines worldwide.
So we're preparing for the wrong stuff, really.
Yeah,
most of us are preparing for massive heat. First of all, it's not happening. Second of all, the data is simulated data. It's not the real data. And third, we're preparing for something that's not occurring and not going to occur. That's
right. That's our belief. And yes, we got this break this spring and summer coming off of the very, very cold winter in the Northern Hemisphere. But La Nina is coming back. The Pacific is very definitely in its cold mode, and that's usually a precursor of a cool spell. It's probably reflecting those downdraft in the solar activity. Even today, the solar minimum was reached in December 2008, and we're a year and a half, 8 months into the new solar cycle, and it's struggling. There's an increase. There are some sunspots, but certainly not a very active sun, which is rather typical of recent cycles a couple of years after the minimum. In fact, some of them reach the maximum within 3 years of the solar minimum. And we're still more active, but likely to peak out, I think, somewhere in the 40 to 70 maximum sunspot area. Put that in perspective, the last solar cycle was 120, and the prior one was in the 150s. And in the early 1800s, it was in the 40s.
What are these numbers you're giving?
Average monthly sunspot number.
Okay, got
numbers.
It.
And back in the Maunder minimum, what they called the little ice ages in the 1600s, they went many decades at a time without seeing sunspots. The sun just was absent of these sunspots, and the result was a very significant cooling back then. And the Thames River froze on a very regular basis, and they used to have ice parties on the Thames River as an annual winter event. And the canals in the Netherlands froze every year, and ice skating was common. But they had their issues there. That was the famines, the plagues, the crop failures. Those are characteristic of these cooling eras. Not very attractive. We can hope it's a Dalton minimum. And what warmth we've added through urban growth and population growth on the planet maybe will ease a little bit the pain of the cooling, but we believe strongly a cooling is coming now, not further warming, certainly no catastrophic warming. Let's
talk about greenhouse gases. As a greenhouse, I take homage at the fact that greenhouse gases are bad. They can be on a personal note, but on a climate note, let's talk about what it is. Let's define it. And let's separate the wheat from the chaff. What is a greenhouse gas?
Well, greenhouse gases include water vapor, the primary greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, methane, some of the chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorocarbons that allegedly absorb heat that's